Act 3. Same-sex marriage politics. Internal doctrinal issues and pastoral concerns were not all that was going on. Politics was a major battleground for homosexuality, which affected a lot more than just church members. So, in the mid-1990s, the LDS Church became deeply involved in leading anti-same-sex ballot measures in states like Hawaii, Alaska, and elsewhere. But the prize was California, and the results paid off in an early 2000 ballot measure known as the Knight Initiative, or Prop 22. LDS leaders had collaborated with the Catholics during this decade in their campaign to prevent the legalization of same-sex marriage around the country. The church also began to heavily emphasize this to its own membership as well in documents like The Family, a Proclamation to the World, and other public preaching that aligned the church with the religious right. In that same fall 2000 issue that we discussed before, there is another article by D. Michael Quinn, Prelude to the National Defense of Marriage Campaign, Civil Discrimination Against Feared or Despised Minorities. This is an important early 50-plus page article documenting LDS political activity in the 1990s on same-sex marriage, culminating in Prop 22. Quinn's argument was that homophobia provided the best explanation for LDS prejudice against same-sex relationships. He set these efforts in historical context of restricting marriage rights for others, what he called despised minorities. He answers many of the common objections to same-sex marriage that people used and argued that it was a civil right. He offered hope for an alternative vision of a more tolerant and inclusive LDS theology. Just a quick note that up on the Dio blog, we have put up a tribute to Quinn's many contributions to dialogue over the years, and we add to the mourning from his passing. In reply to Quinn's article in this same issue, Armand Moss questioned whether the church was motivated by homophobia or a more benevolent force. Letters to the editor in the fall and winter of 2001 were responding to Quinn. Others supported Moss's reply, which suggested that homophobia is not necessarily the reason for church leaders to oppose same-sex marriage. Sexual ethics scholarship was an important area where this came up as well. In the fall 2004 issue, Wayne Scow writes, Sexual Morality Revisited. It was a 4-part discussion that focused on important aspects of sexuality or morality under-discussed by Latter-day Saints. The nature of sexual moral codes, their origins, justifications, and deficiencies. Our sexual nature, its centrality and power, and the implications that result. Several controversial issues, including the morality of homosexuality and the morality of erotic art and literature, and the impact of religious moral restraint on individual sexuality. There's a fascinating response to this in a letter to the editor of the winter 2007 issue titled Celestial Sex, that reflects on many of the problems of LDS sexual theology. Let me mention here a winter 2004 article by Kendall and Darrell White, Ecclesiastical Polity and the Challenge of Homosexuality, 2 cases of divergence within the Mormon tradition. This article compares the Community of Christ to the LDS Church. In the early 2000s, the Community of Christ began to publicly reassess its policies on ordination and acceptance of homosexuality and opened the issue up for deliberation and discussion among various governing bodies. It was a more democratic, congregational polity than the LDS Church's top-down, authoritarian, theocratic model. This article sets these 2 governing traditions in Christian context and offers some history of LDS and Community of Christ doctrines on homosexuality. In fall of 2005, there's a really interesting roundtable on mixed orientation marriages from some of those who are in them and from therapist Mary Beth Raines and longtime advocate Ron Scow. In 2007, there's a really lovely essay by John Gustav Rothal, a man who was excommunicated in 1986 and remains in a relationship, now married to his longtime partner. But he's also deeply committed to the church, attending regularly after having left for other spiritual communities for a time. His essay, Trial of Faith, is a memoir through the history of LDS teachings and his own changing understanding. A spiritual tour de force. I highly recommend this piece. Here's a sampling. The only way any of us can remain committed under these circumstances, I believe, is through an intimate relationship with God under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. The only reason I have entered into this path is because the Spirit drew me to it. My ongoing relationship with the Spirit reassures me of God's infinite love for me, of my infinite value to God, and of the unique role I have to play in the unfolding of God's kingdom, even if that role is not understood by my heterosexual brothers and sisters. As we know now, the issue of same-sex marriage did not go away. In 2004, Massachusetts had legalized it. Then the Republican platform advocated a U.S. constitutional amendment against it, and ballot measures to oppose it popped up all over the United States. This issue helped propel George W. Bush to re-election. The church signed on to these efforts, which became more acute as other states were drip, drip, drip moving towards legalization. LDS members were paying more and more attention, and opinions were splitting more and more as well. Two important articles in fall of 2007 are worth mentioning. The Case for and Against Same-Sex Marriage, one by Randolph Muhlstein and the other by Wayne Scow. These were about legal arguments. The case against same-sex marriage argued that marriage was already tenuous and allowing same-sex marriage would doom it, suggesting that people would all become homosexuals if same-sex marriage were an option. But the follow-up letters to the editors are equally worth reading in the fall of 2008 issue, mostly challenging objections to same-sex marriage. Quote, "The logic used by Randolph Muhlstein left me baffled." I'm going to end this section with a fall 2009 roundtable on Proposition 8 in California. After Proposition 22 passed, it was overturned by the courts as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the California Constitution. Opponents of same-sex marriage devised a new proposition to amend the California Constitution to ban same-sex marriage, and the LDS Church announced its public support and activism for the measure in the summer of 2008 before the November election. It was a deeply contentious issue, bringing national attention to the church, whose members provided the bulk of funding for its passage, nearly $40 million. The issue was a breaking point for many in the church, and the roundtable attempts to offer a variety of legal and religious arguments for and against the measure. So we can see how much of the decade of the 2000s was really litigating the political issues around same-sex marriage. We were still seeing people pushing for tolerance, but the church's public policy efforts were a big deal and took up a lot of attention.
Beyond the Block, part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, is a weekly Come Follow Me podcast that centers the marginalized in Mormonism. Join Brother Jones and Brother Knox, a Black lifelong member and a queer convert theologian respectively, as they read the scriptures through the lenses of their identities and others in an effort to bring the culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints closer and more in line with its theology, which centers Christ's justice and compassion. New episodes every Monday.
Dialogue Podcast Network.